He mocked the dead by urinating on a grave. What happened next changed everything. The graveyard was eerily quiet that night, the moonlight casting silver streaks across the rows of weathered headstones. A chilling wind rustled the leaves of the oak trees lining the cemetery, creating a symphony of soft whispers that seemed to echo the stories of the departed. It was the kind of place most people avoided after dark, an unspoken rule rooted in fear, superstition, or perhaps respect for the dead. But for Jason Marks, rules were nothing more than suggestions, and fear was just a word. Jason, a 19-year-old college freshman with an unruly mop of dark hair and a defiant smirk that never left his face, thrived on rebellion. He was the kind of guy who would take a dare just to prove he could, whether it was climbing the tallest tree, sneaking into forbidden places, or, as it happened tonight, desecrating the town's most infamous grave. "Come on, Jason. You don't have to do this," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. She hugged her jacket closer to her body as the cold seeped into her bones. Sarah, Jason's childhood friend, had tagged along reluctantly, hoping to stop him from going through with the dare. Her auburn hair glowed faintly in the moonlight, and her anxious green eyes darted around the cemetery, scanning for any signs of movement. "Relax, Sarah," Jason replied, his tone dripping with mockery. "It's just a stupid grave. What's the worst that could happen? A ghost comes out and lectures me." He chuckled, clearly amused by the thought. The dare had been set earlier that evening during a party at Ryan's house. Fueled by alcohol and bravado, someone had brought up the legend of Old Man Grayson, a wealthy recluse who had lived in the town decades ago. The story went that Grayson had been cruel and vindictive in life, terrorizing anyone who crossed him, even in death. Locals believed his spirit haunted the graveyard, punishing anyone who disrespected his final resting place. "You're all scared of a dead guy," Jason had scoffed at the party. "What's he gonna do? Come back and haunt me?" And so, with taunts and laughter egging him on, Jason had agreed to prove the legend wrong. The plan was simple: sneak into the cemetery, find Grayson's grave, and do something outrageous to show that the story was just that, a story. Now, standing before the ornate marble headstone of Elijah Grayson, Jason's cocky grin widened. The grave was larger than most, its surface engraved with intricate designs and the ominous inscription, "What you sow in life, you shall reap in death." A strange shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she read the words, but Jason seemed unfazed. "All right, let's get this over with," Jason said, unzipping his jacket and stepping forward. "Jason, please," Sarah begged, grabbing his arm. "This isn't funny. Let's just go home." "Come on, Sarah. Don't tell me you believe in this nonsense," Jason replied, shaking her off. "You're too smart for that." Despite her protests, Jason turned his back to the headstone and began unbuckling his belt. Sarah turned away, unable to watch, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Whether it was fear for Jason or an inexplicable sense of dread, she couldn't tell. As Jason laughed and relieved himself on the grave, a sudden gust of wind howled through the cemetery, far stronger than any they'd felt that evening. The trees swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The temperature seemed to plummet, and the air grew thick with an oppressive stillness. "What the?" Jason muttered, zipping up his pants as he looked around. The cockiness in his voice wavered for the first time. "Jason, we need to leave. Now," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Before Jason could respond, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble ever so slightly. It was subtle at first, like a faint vibration, but it quickly grew stronger, as though something beneath the earth was stirring. Jason and Sarah exchanged a panicked glance, their bravado and skepticism replaced by pure terror. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Jason shouted, his voice cracking as he scanned the darkness for any sign of the partygoers who might have followed them. But the graveyard was empty, and then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. It was unlike any sound Sarah had ever heard, primal and filled with an otherworldly rage. She clutched Jason's arm, her nails digging into his skin as tears streamed down her face. "We have to go," she screamed, her voice breaking as she pulled at him. But Jason couldn't move. His legs felt like they were anchored to the spot, his mind racing with disbelief and regret. The growl grew louder, and the ground beneath Grayson's grave began to crack, thin lines snaking outward like the roots of a tree. Jason had mocked the dead, but now it seemed the dead were ready to answer. Jason's knees buckled slightly as the ground continued to rumble beneath him. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear as he clutched Sarah's arm. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable just moments ago, was now completely shattered. The cracks spreading from Grayson's grave glowed faintly, a sickly green light pulsating from beneath the earth. "Jason, what's happening?" Sarah cried, her voice cracking as panic took over. "I don't know," Jason yelled, his voice tinged with both anger and terror. "It's probably just some underground." He stopped mid-sentence as the sound of the growling grew louder, now accompanied by what sounded like faint whispers, unintelligible but haunting. The air around them felt heavy, as though it were pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Sarah's mind raced, replaying everything that had led to this moment. Jason had always been like this, reckless, arrogant, and too proud to back down from a challenge. She thought back to the times they'd gotten in trouble as kids, Jason always dragging her into his schemes. It was his way of proving himself to the world, of hiding the insecurities he never let anyone see. But this was different. This wasn't a prank or a dare that could be laughed off later. Something unnatural was happening, and it was all because Jason couldn't resist crossing the line. "Sarah, run!" Jason finally shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the grave. They sprinted through the cemetery, weaving between the rows of headstones, their breath visible in the freezing air. Sarah's legs burned as she struggled to keep up, the adrenaline coursing through her veins the only thing keeping her moving. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were following, taunting them. Jason's mind raced with excuses. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head, that it was some elaborate trick set up by the guys at the party. But deep down he knew the truth. This wasn't a prank. This was real, and he had caused it. They reached the edge of the cemetery, the iron gate looming ahead. Jason yanked it open, and the two of them stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. The whispers faded as they put distance between themselves and the graveyard, but the oppressive feeling lingered. "Jason, what the hell was that?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. I don't know," Jason admitted, running a hand through his messy hair. For the first time in years, he looked vulnerable, his usual bravado stripped away. Maybe it was the wind or some kind of earthquake. "Earthquakes don't glow, Jason, and they don't sound like they're alive." Sarah shot back, her hands trembling. Jason opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the look in Sarah's eyes, fear, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just scared. She was horrified. "Look," Jason said, softening his tone. "I'll go back tomorrow and fix it, okay? I'll clean up the grave, say some kind of apology or whatever. It'll be fine. You don't get it, do you?" Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "This isn't something you can just fix. You desecrated a grave. Grayson's grave. Everyone knows his story. You've heard what people say about him." Jason rolled his eyes, though the gesture felt hollow. Yeah. Evil old guy. Terrorized the town, blah, blah. "It's just a story, Sarah." "Is it?" Sarah shot back, because what just happened back there didn't feel like a story. It felt real. Jason fell silent, his usual retorts and sarcasm failing him. Deep down, he couldn't deny it. The glow, the whispers, the growling. It was real. But admitting it meant acknowledging he'd made a terrible mistake, and Jason wasn't ready to do that. As they walked down the dark, empty street, Sarah glanced back at the cemetery, half expecting to see something or someone following them. The wind had died down, and the night was eerily still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "You should tell someone," Sarah said after a long pause. "Your parents, maybe, or the police." "And say what?" "Hi, I peed on a grave and now it's haunted." "Yeah, that'll go over great," Jason scoffed, though his laugh lacked its usual confidence. "I'm serious, Jason," Sarah insisted. "Something bad is going to happen. I can feel it." Jason didn't respond. He couldn't, because deep down he felt it too. That night, long after Sarah had gone home, Jason sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling. The events at the cemetery replayed in his mind, each detail more vivid than the last. The inscription on the grave, the cracks in the earth, the whispers. They were burned into his memory. He tried to convince himself it was all a coincidence, but as the hours ticked by, an uneasy feeling settled over him. It was as if the air in his room had grown heavier, the shadows in the corners darker. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. Jason froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He held his breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was coming from the direction of his window. Jason's blood ran cold as he slowly turned his head, dreading what he might see. The window was open, and outside in the darkness, a pair of glowing green eyes stared back at him. Jason's breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the glowing orbs outside his window. He blinked, hoping his mind was playing tricks on him, but the eerie green light didn't waver. It was real. His chest tightened as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. He sat frozen, trapped in the stillness of the moment, his heart pounding like a drum in his ears. The whispering started again, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as it grew louder, it became unmistakably clear. This was no natural sound. Words began to form, though they were garbled and fragmented, as if spoken by someone who hadn't used their voice in centuries. Jason, the sound of his name sent a jolt through his body. He scrambled off the bed, nearly tripping over his shoes in his haste. The glowing eyes didn't move, but the whispers followed him as he backed into the farthest corner of the room. "Leave me alone!" Jason shouted, his voice cracking. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the room fell silent, save for Jason's ragged breathing. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke again. "You've desecrated the sacred. A price must be paid." Jason's legs gave out, and he slid to the floor, his back pressed against the wall. His mind raced with thoughts, each more panicked than the last. What was this thing? Why was it after him? And, most importantly, how could he make it stop? The glowing eyes vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving Jason in the oppressive darkness of his room. He didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, sent his nerves spiraling into overdrive. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through his blinds, Jason's resolve had hardened. He needed to fix this. Whatever it was, whatever he'd done, there had to be a way to undo it. Jason met Sarah outside her house later that morning. Her face was pale, and her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night wrestling with fear. "You look terrible," Jason said, though the irony of his statement wasn't lost on him. "So do you?" Sarah shot back. "What's going on, Jason? Did something happen?" Jason hesitated. He didn't want to tell her about the glowing eyes or the voice in his room. It sounded insane even to him, but he also knew he couldn't face this alone. "Something's wrong," he admitted, his voice low. "I saw something last night in my room. It was watching me." Sarah's expression shifted from concern to fear. "What do you mean, something? Like a person?" "No," Jason said, shaking his head. Not a person. It was... I don't know what it was, but it spoke to me. It said I desecrated something, that I have to pay for it. Sarah's face paled further. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting to see the glowing eyes Jason had described. "We need to tell someone," she said. "Who?" Jason asked, his voice rising. "Who's going to believe us, Sarah? This isn't exactly something you can take to the cops. We could go back to the cemetery," Sarah suggested, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Maybe if we, I don't know, apologize or something, it'll stop." Jason frowned. The thought of going back to that graveyard made his stomach churn, but Sarah was right. They didn't have many options. "Fine," he said reluctantly, "but we're going during the day. No way I'm stepping foot in there at night." The cemetery felt different in the daylight. The eerie whispers and oppressive darkness were gone, replaced by the sound of birds chirping and the warmth of the sun on their skin. But even in the light, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They made their way to Grayson's grave. The earth still cracked and disturbed from the night before. Jason's stomach twisted as he approached, the memories of what had happened flooding back. "Okay," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "What now?" Jason stared at the grave, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? Apologize? Pray? He wasn't exactly the religious type, but he was willing to try anything at this point. "I'm sorry," Jason said awkwardly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean any disrespect. It was a stupid mistake. Okay? I'm sorry." For a moment, nothing happened. Jason let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. Maybe it had worked. Maybe it was over. And then the ground began to shake. Sarah grabbed Jason's arm, her eyes wide with terror as the cracks in the earth began to spread once more. The sickly green light returned, brighter and more intense than before. Jason stumbled backward, pulling Sarah with him as the whispers filled the air again, louder and more menacing than ever. "What's happening?" Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Jason didn't answer. He couldn't, because as he stared at the grave, something began to emerge from the glowing light. A shadowy figure, its form shifting and flickering like smoke in the wind. Jason's breath caught in his throat. Whatever this was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to stop. The figure rising from the grave was unlike anything Jason had ever seen. It was neither solid nor completely transparent, its form shifting like thick smoke caught in an unseen breeze. Its eyes glowed with the same unnatural green light that had haunted Jason the night before, and as it took shape, the whispers became deafening. Jason's entire body screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. Sarah, gripping his arm with all her strength, trembled beside him. The figure finally spoke, its voice layered and distorted, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "You have disturbed my rest. You will suffer as I have suffered." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but no words came. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way. Jason and Sarah tumbled backward as a shockwave rippled through the cemetery, knocking over several headstones. Sarah let out a terrified scream as she hit the ground hard, scraping her palms on jagged rocks. Jason barely had time to register the pain in his own body before an unnatural chill swept over them, sucking the warmth from the air. A heavy weight settled on Jason's chest, like an invisible force pressing down on him. His breaths grew shallow as the figure drifted closer, its glowing eyes boring into him. He felt something inside him shift, like icy fingers clawing at his soul. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The whispers faded into an eerie silence. Jason gasped for air, his body trembling as he scrambled to his feet. What was that?" he stammered. Sarah, still wide-eyed and shaking, clutched at her chest. "We need to get out of here. Now." They didn't wait. Stumbling over uneven ground, they ran out of the cemetery, their breaths ragged and their bodies aching. Only when they were safely on the sidewalk, several blocks away, did they finally slow down. Jason wiped his forehead, his skin clammy with cold sweat. "This isn't over," he muttered. Sarah shot him a horrified look. "What are you talking about?" "Jason, we barely made it out of there. We need to leave this alone." Jason shook his head. "It won't stop. I felt it. It's inside me." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, inside you?" Jason hesitated, running a shaky hand through his hair. "I don't know, but when it looked at me, I felt like something was pulling me apart." He clenched his fists. "I think I brought something back with me." Sarah's blood ran cold. Whatever Jason had done, whatever curse he had unleashed, it wasn't just haunting the graveyard anymore. It was following him. The weight of Jason's words hung between them, thick with unspoken terror. Sarah's lips parted as if to argue, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but deep down, she knew he was right. Something had changed. The air around Jason felt different, colder, heavier, almost like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface of his skin. They stood in uneasy silence, the quiet of the early evening pressing down on them. The distant hum of cars and chatter of pedestrians seemed too normal, too detached from the nightmare they had just experienced. Then Jason flinched. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as his body lurched forward, like something had shoved him from behind. His hands shot to his head, gripping his temples, and his face twisted in pain. "Jason," Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice laced with panic. "What's wrong?" Jason squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing ragged. "It's in my head," he croaked. Sarah's heart pounded. What's in your head?" Jason shook violently, his fingers digging into his scalp as if trying to claw something out. "The whispers. They're inside me now. I can hear them." Sarah barely had time to react before Jason's body went rigid. His head snapped up and his eyes... Sarah stumbled back in horror. Jason's eyes were glowing green. For a moment, he just stood there, his breathing eerily even, his expression blank. Then, in a voice that wasn't entirely his own, he whispered, "He's coming." A sudden gust of wind whipped through the street, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. Street lights flickered. The temperature plummeted, the warmth of the summer evening replaced by an unnatural chill. Jason let out a strangled sound and collapsed to his knees, gripping his chest. "It's not just following me, Sarah," he gasped. "It's trying to take me." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. This was no longer about just seeing a ghost. Whatever Jason had disturbed, whatever had latched onto him, it wanted more. She had no idea how to stop it. Jason's body convulsed once more, before he fell completely still. Sarah dropped beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Jason, stay with me." Then, slowly, Jason looked up. The green glow in his eyes faded slightly, but his expression was hollow, distant, like he wasn't entirely there anymore. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Jason, you have to fight this. We're gonna fix it, okay? We'll find a way." Jason's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can." A deep, guttural laugh echoed in the distance, sending a bone-chilling dread through Sarah's veins. Whatever had been haunting them was no longer just a presence. It was coming, and it wasn't going to stop until it had Jason completely. The night air felt thick and suffocating as Sarah half-dragged Jason through the dimly lit streets. His body was heavy against her, his skin cold to the touch. Every few seconds, he would let out a low, pained groan, his breath ragged. His eyes had returned to normal, but Sarah knew it was only temporary. Whatever force had latched onto him was still inside him, waiting. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Jason stumbled again, nearly pulling both of them down. He let out a weak chuckle. "You should just leave me, Sarah. This thing, whatever it is, it won't stop until it gets what it wants." Sarah shook her head fiercely. "Shut up, Jason. I'm not leaving you." A street lamp ahead of them flickered. Then another. Then another. The moment the last light went out, the whispers returned. Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't whispers anymore. The voices were clearer, sharper, like dozens of people speaking at once, chanting. Jason stiffened beside her, his breath hitching. Then, from the shadows, it stepped forward. Sarah's scream caught in her throat. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its body shifting like smoke. The face was wrong, twisted, stretched too wide, but the eyes were unmistakable. That same glowing green, hollow and endless. Jason's entire body locked up. He gasped as his back arched unnaturally, his feet lifting slightly off the ground. His mouth opened, but the only sound that came out was a strangled choke. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jason, fight it!" The figure's head tilted, its voice echoing in the air like 1,000 distorted whispers layered together. "He is already mine." Sarah's chest tightened. "No, he's not," she shouted. "You don't get to take him." The entity let out a deep, guttural laugh. The air around them rippled, as if reality itself was unraveling. Jason suddenly gasped, his entire body trembling. He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with terror. "It's pulling me in," he choked out. "I can't stop it." Sarah's heart pounded. Think. Then, suddenly, something clicked. The grave. This all started at the grave. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for a way out, a direction to run. The cemetery was just beyond the next street. If they could get there, if they could fix whatever Jason had disturbed, maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. She gritted her teeth. They had to try. Summoning every ounce of strength, Sarah yanked Jason forward. "Come on!" Jason barely had time to react before she was dragging him, running toward the graveyard. The entity shrieked tore through the night, but Sarah didn't look back. She didn't dare, because if she did, she knew she'd see it closing in. Sarah's lungs burned as she pulled Jason toward the cemetery gates, her heart hammering in her chest. The air behind them crackled with an unnatural energy, the entity's shriek growing louder, closer. It wasn't going to let them go. Jason stumbled, his body growing heavier with every step. His breathing was ragged, his skin deathly pale. He was slipping away. Sarah clenched her jaw and yanked him forward with all her strength. "Just a little more, Jason. We're almost there." They burst through the rusted cemetery gates, just as a violent gust of wind slammed them shut behind them. The whispers surged, circling them like a rising storm. The entity's presence pressed against Sarah's back, cold and suffocating. Then she saw it, the grave, the one Jason had desecrated. The headstone was cracked, the disturbed earth beneath it darker than the surrounding soil. Sarah could feel it now. This was the source of everything. Jason let out a strangled gasp. His eyes flickered green again, his body contorting in pain. The entity was trying to take him completely. "Think, Sarah." Her eyes darted to the shattered headstone. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a curse. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "Jason, we have to set it right. We have to fix what you did." Jason's breath hitched. He looked at the grave, realization dawning on his face. His hands trembled as he dropped to his knees beside it. I didn't mean to," he choked out, his voice barely audible. Sarah grabbed his hand. "Then tell it. Apologize. Mean it." Jason's entire body shook as he placed a trembling hand on the disturbed soil. His voice cracked with emotion. "I'm sorry." His breath hitched. "I was stupid. I didn't respect you, and now you're hurting me because of it. I get it. But please let me go." The air around them stilled. The whispers faltered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the earth beneath them shifted. The wind howled as the ground rumbled, and the shadows around the grave began to recede. The entity let out a piercing wail, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a gale. Jason gasped, clutching his chest as if something had just been ripped out of him. The green glow in his eyes flickered and then vanished. And just like that, the night fell silent. Sarah held her breath, waiting. but the air was still. The presence was gone. Jason collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but free. Sarah let out a shaky breath and looked at the grave, the soil now eerily undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. But they both knew better. Some things should never be disrespected. And the dead? They never forget. The silence in the cemetery was deafening. No more whispers. No more piercing wails. Just the still night air and the soft rustling of leaves in the distance. Sarah sat beside Jason on the cold ground, her body trembling from exhaustion. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, leaving her breathless. Jason was still, his chest rising and falling unevenly as he fought to catch his breath. His hands, once ice-cold, were beginning to warm again. He was alive. He was himself. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah allowed herself to believe it was over. Jason swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was gone." He lifted a shaking hand to his forehead, as if expecting to feel the remnants of whatever had tried to claim him. But it was gone. The presence, the pull, the terror. Sarah nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. So did I. The events of the last few hours played over and over in her mind. Jason's arrogance, the grave, the curse. They had faced something no one would ever believe. Something they could barely believe. Jason let out a shaky breath and stared at the grave, now eerily undisturbed. The headstone, once cracked, seemed more solid, less broken. Had the spirit accepted his apology? Had the curse truly lifted? "I was such an idiot," Jason whispered, his voice raw with guilt. "I didn't think. I thought it was funny." He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. Regret. True, genuine regret. Sarah didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He already knew the answer. Jason turned back to the grave, his fingers tracing the damp grass beneath him. "Whoever you were," he murmured, "I'm sorry." A soft wind swept through the cemetery, cool against their skin. Unlike before, it wasn't chilling or unnatural. It was peaceful. Sarah exhaled and stood up, brushing dirt off her jeans. "We need to go." Jason hesitated but nodded. They didn't belong here. Not anymore. They made their way toward the cemetery gates, moving slowly, cautiously. Jason's legs were still weak, and Sarah kept a close eye on him, ready to catch him if he stumbled. But he didn't. As they reached the entrance, Jason hesitated and looked back one last time. The graveyard stretched out before them, dark but quiet, as if it had returned to the way it was supposed to be. He swallowed hard. "I'll never forget this." Sarah shivered. Neither would she. Without another word, they stepped through the gates and into the empty street, leaving the past, and whatever had lurked in it, behind them. The night air felt different as Sarah and Jason walked away from the cemetery, lighter, less suffocating. The weight that had clung to them since the moment Jason mocked the grave had finally lifted. But the experience had left its mark. They walked in silence for a long time, their footsteps echoing on the empty pavement. Jason's head was lowered, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He had always been the loud, reckless type, the one who joked too much, who never took anything seriously. But now, there was a heaviness in his expression, a quietness that hadn't been there before. Sarah glanced at him. "You okay?" Jason let out a slow breath. "I don't know." He hesitated, then looked at her. That was real, wasn't it?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, it was." Jason shook his head, staring at the ground. "I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what happened tonight. I don't even know if I want to." He swallowed hard. "I was an idiot. I disrespected something I didn't understand. And it nearly took me." Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded. "You got lucky." Jason let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, lucky." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I've done a lot of stupid things before, but this was different. I was playing with something I had no business messing with." They reached the intersection where their paths usually split, Sarah's house was to the left, Jason's to the right. Normally, Jason would throw a joke at her before heading off, acting like nothing ever bothered him. But tonight, he just stood there, looking at her. "I think I need to be better," he said quietly. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You mean not peeing on graves?" Jason huffed a small laugh, but shook his head. "I mean in general. I've never really thought about how my actions affect things. I just do stuff. But after tonight, I don't know. I guess I realized some things shouldn't be messed with. Some things deserve respect." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, they do." A comfortable silence stretched between them. Finally, Jason took a step back, glancing toward his street. "I should probably get home before my mom loses her mind." Sarah smirked. "That might be scarier than what we just went through." Jason chuckled, but then grew serious again. "Hey, thanks for not giving up on me back there." Sarah shrugged. "Somebody's got to keep you alive." Jason gave her a small, grateful smile before turning and walking away. Sarah watched him for a moment before heading home herself, the events of the night still playing in her mind. One thing was for sure, they would never forget what happened. And Jason, he would never mock the dead again.